The summer heat in London was unbearable that Tuesday morning. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked through the crowded streets near Buckingham Palace. She had saved money for 3 years to make this dream trip to England happen. As a single mother working 2 jobs in Phoenix, Arizona, every penny counted. But seeing the Royal Guards had always been on her bucket list. Sarah clutched her camera tightly, excited to capture every moment. Her 12-year-old son, Miguel, was back home with her mother, and she had promised to bring back hundreds of photos to show him. The palace grounds were packed with tourists from around the world, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. She found a good spot near the entrance where one of the guards stood perfectly still. His name was James Thompson, though Sarah didn't know that. James had been serving as a royal guard for 8 years. At 32, he was one of the more experienced guards, known for his unwavering discipline and dedication to duty. His colleagues respected him, and his superiors trusted him completely. James stood motionless in the blazing sun, sweat pooling beneath his heavy red tunic and thick black bearskin hat. The uniform weighed nearly 20 pounds, and the temperature inside felt like a furnace. But James had trained for this. He had learned to ignore discomfort, to stand perfectly still for hours regardless of weather conditions. Rain or shine, heat or cold, nothing was supposed to break his concentration. Sarah positioned herself about 10 feet away from James, adjusting her camera settings. She wanted the perfect shot to show Miguel how impressive these guards really were. As she focused her lens, she noticed something that made her heart sink. Tiny beads of sweat were rolling down the guard's face, and his skin looked flushed beneath his hat. The man was clearly suffering in the intense heat, but he couldn't move or even wipe his face. Other tourists around her seemed oblivious to the guard's discomfort. They posed for selfies, laughed loudly, and some even tried to make the guard react by waving their hands in front of his face. Sarah felt uncomfortable watching this. The guard was a human being, not a statue for entertainment. She remembered her own struggles working long shifts at the restaurant during Arizona summers when the air conditioning broke down. The exhaustion, the dehydration, the feeling of being trapped with no relief in sight. Her supervisor had strict rules about not leaving the floor during busy hours, no matter how awful she felt. Sarah's water bottle was ice cold, condensation dripping down its sides. She had bought it from a vendor just minutes earlier, knowing how important it was to stay hydrated in this heat. As she watched James struggle silently, an idea formed in her mind. It was probably against the rules, maybe even illegal, but she couldn't just stand there and watch someone suffer. She looked around nervously. Other tourists were busy taking photos and chatting among themselves. A few police officers were stationed nearby, but they were dealing with crowd control and didn't seem to be watching her specifically. Sarah's heart began to race as she made her decision. Moving slowly and carefully, she stepped closer to James. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but she could see the strain in his face more clearly now. His breathing was slightly labored, and sweat continued to drip steadily from beneath his hat. She felt terrible for him. Sarah unscrewed the cap of her water bottle, the sound barely audible over the crowd noise. She knew this could get her in serious trouble. She might be arrested, banned from the palace grounds, or worse. But looking at this suffering man, she couldn't bring herself to care about the consequences. With one quick motion, she tilted the bottle and let a small stream of cool water splash onto James's face and neck. The water ran down his cheeks and soaked into his collar, providing instant relief from the oppressive heat. For a split second, Sarah thought she saw the tiniest hint of gratitude in his eyes, though his expression remained officially neutral. The tourists around them hadn't noticed what happened. Sarah quickly stepped back, screwing the cap back onto her bottle and pretending to adjust her camera. Her hands were shaking from nervousness and adrenaline. She had no idea what would happen next. James felt the cool water hit his overheated skin like a blessing. For 8 years, he had endured every kind of weather and discomfort without breaking protocol. He had been trained never to react to anything tourists did, no matter how annoying or inappropriate. But this was different. This wasn't someone trying to get a reaction for entertainment. This was pure human kindness. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The cool water evaporated quickly in the heat, but those few seconds of coolness felt like heaven. James had to fight every instinct to smile, to nod his thanks, to acknowledge what this stranger had done for him. Protocol demanded he remain motionless and expressionless, but inside something shifted. In all his years of service, countless tourists had tried to make him laugh, flinch, or break character. They had shouted, waved, made jokes, and even touched him inappropriately. He had learned to see tourists as annoyances to be endured. But this woman had seen him as a human being who needed help. Sarah stood frozen, waiting for security guards to rush over and arrest her. She expected alarms, shouting, chaos. Instead, nothing happened. The crowd continued their chattering and photo-taking as if nothing had occurred. James remained at his post, still as a statue, giving no indication that anything had changed. But everything had changed. Sarah had crossed an invisible line between tourist and human being. She had risked getting in trouble to help a complete stranger, and James would never forget that moment of compassion. Neither of them knew it yet, but this simple act of kindness was about to create ripples that would affect both their lives in ways they never could have imagined. The heat continued to beat down mercilessly, but James felt different now. The woman with the water bottle had reminded him that behind all the ceremony and tradition, they were all just people trying to get through another day. 20 minutes passed since Sarah had splashed the water on James. She remained nearby, pretending to study the palace architecture while secretly keeping an eye on the guard. Her nervousness had settled into a warm feeling of satisfaction. She had helped someone who needed it, even if he couldn't thank her. James continued his duty, but his mind kept returning to that moment of unexpected kindness. The water had dried completely now, but the memory of relief remained vivid. He had served in extremely challenging conditions before, including a memorable day when protesters had thrown paint at the guards. Through it all, he had maintained his composure. But today felt different because of one tourist's simple act of humanity. Other guards were positioned around the palace grounds, and James noticed his colleague Robert stationed about 50 yards away. Robert had been watching the interaction and was puzzled by what he had seen. Guards were trained to observe everything in their peripheral vision, even while appearing to stare straight ahead. Robert had clearly seen the woman pour water on James, but James hadn't reacted at all. No alarm had been raised. No security had intervened. Sarah decided to take a few more photos before moving on to other parts of London. She had a full itinerary planned for her week-long trip, including the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, and several museums. But as she prepared to leave, she noticed something that made her pause. A small group of teenage tourists had gathered near James, and they were behaving badly. They were trying to get him to react by making faces, shouting jokes, and one boy was even pretending to march back and forth in front of him mockingly. Sarah felt her protective instincts kick in. After what she had witnessed of this guard's dedication and professionalism, seeing him disrespected this way made her angry. The teenagers were speaking loudly in what sounded like German, laughing, as they took turns trying to break the guard's concentration. One girl pulled out her phone and started recording while her friend danced inappropriately close to James. Sarah could see the tension in his jaw, though his eyes remained fixed forward. Sarah approached the group with determination. Her Spanish accent became slightly more pronounced when she was upset as it did now. "Excuse me," she said firmly to the teenagers. "He's doing his job. Please show some respect." The German tourists looked at her with surprise and annoyance. The boy who had been marching said something in German that made his friends laugh. Sarah didn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly dismissive. The girl with the phone kept recording, now turning the camera towards Sarah as if she was part of the entertainment. "You need to stop this," Sarah said more loudly, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "This is a real person, not a toy for your amusement." Her words caught the attention of other tourists nearby. Some looked embarrassed by the teenagers' behavior, while others seemed annoyed at Sarah for causing a scene. A middle-aged British couple approached, and the woman spoke up in support of Sarah. "She's absolutely right," the British woman said with authority. "This is disgraceful behavior. These guards deserve our respect, not mockery." The teenagers realized they were now the center of unwanted attention from multiple adults. Other tourists were staring, and some were shaking their heads disapprovingly. The boy who had been the ringleader muttered something under his breath, but the group began to disperse. The girl put away her phone, and they moved away from James toward a different area of the palace grounds. James had heard every word of the exchange, though he gave no outward sign of it. The same woman who had helped him with the water was now defending him against harassment. He was deeply moved by her actions, though he couldn't show it. In his 8 years of service, tourists had occasionally defended guards against particularly bad behavior, but it was rare. Most people either ignored the harassment or treated it as part of the show. Sarah felt her heart pounding from the confrontation. She wasn't normally someone who got involved in public disputes, but something about this situation had triggered her protective instincts. Maybe it was thinking about her son Miguel, who was often shy and couldn't defend himself well against bullies. Maybe it was remembering her own experiences with difficult customers at work, who treated her as less than human. The British couple introduced themselves as Margaret and David Collins. They were from Manchester and had been visiting London for their wedding anniversary. Margaret thanked Sarah for speaking up. "It's awful how some people behave," Margaret said, shaking her head. "These young men and women serve our country with honor. They don't deserve to be treated like circus animals." David nodded in agreement. "My nephew served as a royal guard for 2 years. The training is incredibly demanding, and the job requires tremendous discipline. People don't realize how difficult it really is." As they talked, Sarah learned more about the guards' duties and training. She discovered that they were all active military personnel, not just ceremonial figures. They had real responsibilities for security and had undergone extensive military training. James, still standing motionless nearby, represented years of dedication and service to his country. The conversation with Margaret and David made Sarah realize that her simple act with the water bottle had been more significant than she initially thought. She hadn't just helped someone cool off on a hot day. She had acknowledged the humanity of someone whose job required him to seem inhuman. As the afternoon wore on, word began to spread among the tourists about what had happened. Some had witnessed Sarah's defense of the guard against the teenagers, and the story grew in the telling. A few tourists approached Sarah to express their admiration for her actions. Others began to look at the guards differently, seeing them as real people rather than living statues. James noticed the change in atmosphere around his post. Tourists were being more respectful, speaking in quieter tones, and several had even nodded politely in his direction. One elderly man had quietly said, "Thank you for your service," as he passed by. These small gestures meant more to James than he could express. Sarah finally decided it was time to continue her sightseeing. She had spent much longer at the palace than planned, but it had been worth it. As she prepared to leave, she took one last look at James. He remained perfectly still, professional and dignified in his duty. She didn't know it, but James was also looking at her reflection in the polished brass of a nearby post. He wanted to remember her face, this stranger who had shown him such unexpected kindness and then defended him against harassment. In all his years of service, he had never experienced anything quite like this day. As Sarah walked away, she felt a strange connection to this place and this moment. She had come to London as a tourist seeking photos and memories. Instead, she had discovered something deeper about human connection and the importance of seeing others as real people, regardless of their circumstances or the roles they were required to play. The next morning, Sarah woke up in her small hotel room near Victoria Station, still thinking about the events at Buckingham Palace. She had planned to visit the British Museum today, but something pulled her back toward the palace. She told herself it was just because she wanted to get better photos in the softer morning light, but deep down she knew it was more than that. Meanwhile, James was getting ready for another day of duty. As he put on his uniform in the barracks, his fellow guards were talking about yesterday's unusual events. Word had spread among the guards about the American tourist who had helped James and then defended him against harassment. It wasn't often that tourists showed such genuine respect and concern. "Never seen anything like it in my 5 years here," said Robert, the guard who had witnessed the water incident. "The woman actually cared about your well-being, mate. Most tourists just see us as photo opportunities." James nodded quietly as he adjusted his tunic. He had been thinking about Sarah all night. Her actions had reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. When he first became a royal guard, he had felt proud to represent his country and be part of such an ancient tradition. Over the years, dealing with increasingly disrespectful tourists had made him somewhat cynical. But yesterday had restored something he thought he had lost: "I heard she's coming back today," said another guard named William. Some of the palace staff were talking about it. Apparently she asked the information desk about the guard's schedule and duties, seemed genuinely interested in learning more. This news surprised James. Most tourists visited once, took their photos, and moved on to the next attraction. The fact that Sarah was returning suggested her interest went deeper than casual sightseeing. Sarah arrived at the palace around 10 in the morning, carrying a small backpack with water bottles and some snacks. She had done research the night before on her phone, learning about the history and traditions of the royal guards. She was amazed to discover how physically and mentally demanding their job really was. The guards typically stood for 2 hours at a time before being relieved. During that time, they were not allowed to move, speak, or acknowledge the public in any way. They had to ignore everything from weather extremes to tourist harassment. The training to become a royal guard took months and included rigorous physical conditioning and mental discipline exercises. When Sarah reached the palace grounds, she saw James at his usual post. He looked as professional and composed as ever, but she noticed he seemed somehow different today. There was something in his bearing that suggested alertness and energy rather than just duty and endurance. Sarah positioned herself at a respectful distance and began taking photos, but her real focus was observing the interaction between guards and tourists. She was pleased to see that the behavior seemed better today. Tourists were speaking more quietly, and she didn't see anyone trying to harass or mock the guards. Around 11:30, Sarah noticed something concerning. The temperature was rising again, and James had been standing motionless for over an hour and a half. She could see signs of heat stress beginning to show, the same subtle indicators she had noticed yesterday. His breathing was slightly elevated, and she could detect the beginning of perspiration on his face. But today, Sarah was better prepared. She had brought multiple cold water bottles and had even frozen one overnight, so it would stay cold longer. She also had small packets of cooling wipes that she used during her long shifts in Arizona. She knew she was probably pushing boundaries, but she couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer when she had the means to help. This time, Sarah was more strategic about her approach. She waited until a large tour group was passing by, creating natural cover and distraction. She also positioned herself so that the nearest security cameras wouldn't have a clear view of her actions. Moving confidently but carefully, Sarah approached James again. This time, she had unscrewed the water bottle cap beforehand and had cooling wipes ready in her other hand. She quickly splashed a small amount of cold water on his face and neck, then gently wiped his forehead with the cooling cloth before stepping back. The relief was even more pronounced than yesterday. The frozen water bottle had kept the water ice cold, and the cooling wipes provided additional comfort. James felt his body temperature drop significantly, and the refreshing sensation helped clear his head and restore his energy. This time, several other tourists noticed what Sarah had done. An elderly Japanese man smiled and nodded approvingly at her. A young mother with children looked impressed and whispered to her husband about the kindness they had just witnessed. Word began to spread quietly among the crowd that someone was helping the guard deal with the heat. Sarah's actions inspired others. A British businessman approached her quietly and offered to share his own cold drinks to help the guards. A group of college students from Canada asked if there was anything they could do to help. Sarah found herself becoming an unofficial coordinator of guard welfare, something she had never expected when she planned her London vacation. The guards can't accept anything directly, Sarah explained to the growing group of concerned tourists. But we can help them stay cool and comfortable without getting them in trouble. They're doing such an important job and they can't take care of themselves while they're on duty. The word spread further and more tourists began bringing water and cooling supplies. Sarah showed them how to approach respectfully and provide relief without creating a disturbance or putting the guards at risk. She established a rotation system so different people could help throughout the day, ensuring no single guard suffered too much in the heat. James was amazed by what was happening. Not only was the same woman helping him again, but she had somehow inspired other tourists to care about the guards' welfare too. He could hear the conversations around him, and the tone had completely changed from yesterday. Instead of treating the guards as entertainment, tourists were discussing their service and sacrifice. By early afternoon, palace security had noticed the change in tourist behavior. The guards were clearly more comfortable and alert, and there had been far fewer incidents of harassment or inappropriate behavior. The security supervisors were puzzled but pleased by the improvement. Captain Morrison, the officer in charge of guard duties, decided to investigate what was causing this positive change. He had been monitoring the situation from inside the palace and had noticed the unusual level of tourist cooperation and respect. When he learned about the American woman who had been helping the guards and organizing other tourists to do the same, he was both impressed and concerned. Morrison knew that, strictly speaking, what Sarah was doing violated protocols about public interaction with the guards, but he also recognized that her actions came from genuine compassion and were actually improving security by creating better relations with the public. He decided he needed to speak with this woman directly to understand her motivations and ensure she understood the boundaries. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah continued coordinating tourist assistance for the guards. She had unknowingly created a small movement of people who cared about the welfare of these silent servants. James, still standing at his post, felt more respected and valued than he had in years. Neither Sarah nor James realized that their story was about to take another unexpected turn, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about duty, protocol, and human connection. Captain Morrison approached Sarah during the afternoon shift change, when the guards were briefly rotating positions. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, though his expression was serious. Sarah felt her heart sink when she saw him walking directly toward her. She was certain she was about to be arrested or banned from the palace grounds. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Morrison," he said politely but formally. "I understand you've been assisting our guards with the heat. I'd like to have a word with you if you don't mind." Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety. She looked around nervously, noticing that several of the tourists who had been helping were now watching the interaction with concern. She nodded silently, unable to trust her voice. "Please don't worry," Captain Morrison said, noticing her obvious distress. "You're not in trouble. I simply want to understand what you've been doing and why." They walked to a quieter area near the palace gardens, away from the crowds. Sarah's hands were shaking as she tried to explain her actions. "I'm sorry if I broke rules," she said, her accent more pronounced due to her nervousness. "I just couldn't watch him suffering in the heat. I know it was probably wrong, but I had to help." Captain Morrison studied her face carefully. In his 25 years of military service, he had become skilled at reading people's motivations. What he saw in Sarah was genuine compassion, not someone seeking attention or trying to cause trouble. "Tell me about yourself," he said gently. "What brought you to London?" Sarah found herself opening up to this stern but surprisingly kind officer. She told him about saving money for 3 years to make this trip, about wanting to bring back photos for her son Miguel, about working 2 jobs to support her family. She explained how seeing the guards suffering in the heat had reminded her of her own difficult work experiences. "I've worked long shifts in terrible conditions," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I know what it's like when you can't take a break, when you have to keep working no matter how awful you feel. I couldn't just stand there and watch someone go through that when I could help." Captain Morrison was moved by her story. He had spent his career around military personnel, and he recognized the deep empathy of someone who truly understood sacrifice and hardship. Sarah wasn't a privileged tourist treating the guards as entertainment. She was a working mother who had recognized a fellow worker in need. "What you've done is quite remarkable," the captain said, surprising Sarah completely. "In my years overseeing guard duties, I've never seen tourists show such genuine concern for our personnel. You've actually improved morale and security conditions significantly." Sarah looked at him in disbelief. "I'm not in trouble?" "Quite the opposite," Captain Morrison smiled. "However, we do need to discuss how to handle this situation going forward. What you're doing is wonderful, but we need to ensure it doesn't compromise security or protocol." Meanwhile, James had been relieved from his post and was changing out of his ceremonial uniform. He had heard rumors that the American woman was speaking with Captain Morrison, and he was worried she might be facing consequences for her kindness. He knew he was taking a risk, but he decided to speak with the captain himself. James found Captain Morrison in his office an hour later. "Sir, I heard about the tourist who's been helping with the heat situation. I wanted to speak on her behalf." "Ah, Thompson," Captain Morrison said, looking up from his paperwork. "I was hoping you'd come see me. I've just had a very interesting conversation with the lady in question. Tell me your perspective on what's been happening." James chose his words carefully, Sir, what she did was completely unexpected and incredibly thoughtful. In 8 years of service, I've never experienced anything like it. She saw me as a person, not just a uniform, and then she inspired other tourists to show the same respect and consideration. How did it affect your ability to perform your duties? The captain asked. It improved it significantly, sir, James replied honestly. The heat relief helped me maintain better focus and alertness, and the change in tourist behavior created a much more manageable working environment. Instead of dealing with harassment and distraction, I could concentrate fully on security and protocol. Captain Morrison nodded thoughtfully. That matches my observations. The question now is how to proceed. We can't officially endorse tourists providing assistance to guards, but what's been happening has had entirely positive effects. That evening, Captain Morrison made an unusual decision. He arranged for Sarah to have a private tour of parts of the palace normally off-limits to tourists. He wanted her to understand the full scope of the guards' training and responsibilities, and he had an idea about how her actions might fit into a larger solution. Sarah was amazed to learn about the history and traditions she was witnessing. The royal guards weren't just ceremonial figures, but active military personnel with real security responsibilities. Their training was intense and comprehensive, covering everything from crowd control to emergency response. The public sees the ceremony, Captain Morrison explained as they walked through the training facilities, but they don't understand the reality of the service. These men and women are highly trained soldiers who happen to perform public duties while maintaining national security. As they talked, Captain Morrison shared his idea with Sarah. What if we found a way to channel your concern for guard welfare into something more official? We've been discussing improvements to heat safety protocols for some time. Your actions have demonstrated that thoughtful public support can actually enhance rather than compromise security. Sarah was intrigued but cautious. What are you thinking? A partnership, Captain Morrison said. We could develop an educational program that teaches tourists about guard duties and appropriate ways to show respect. You could help us design materials that explain why the guards can't interact directly with the public, but how the public can still show appreciation in appropriate ways. The idea excited Sarah more than she expected. This trip to London was supposed to be a simple vacation, but it was turning into something much more meaningful. She thought about Miguel back home and how proud he would be to learn that his mother had helped make things better for the royal guards. I would love to help, Sarah said, but I'm only here for a few more days and then I have to go back to Arizona. We'll work with the time we have, Captain Morrison assured her. And perhaps this could be the beginning of a longer relationship. We have exchange programs with various international organizations. Someone with your perspective and communication skills could be very valuable. As they concluded their meeting, both Sarah and Captain Morrison felt they were on the verge of something significant. What had started as a simple act of kindness was evolving into something that could benefit guards and tourists for years to come. James, meanwhile, was having dinner with his fellow guards and sharing the news about Sarah's meeting with the captain. The other guards were amazed that a tourist's kindness had led to such high-level attention and potential policy changes. She really cared about us, Robert said, shaking his head in wonder. When was the last time that happened? The guards began discussing their own experiences with difficult tourist behavior and how much Sarah's actions had meant to them. They realized that her simple gesture had reminded them of the dignity and importance of their service, something they had gradually lost sight of over years of dealing with disrespectful crowds. None of them knew that tomorrow would bring an even more surprising development, one that would test everything they had learned about duty, protocol, and human connection. The next morning brought unexpected news that would change everything. Captain Morrison received a call from the palace's media relations department, informing him that a video of Sarah helping James had gone viral on social media. Someone had recorded her splashing water on the guard and defending him against the teenagers, and the footage had been shared thousands of times overnight. The video showed Sarah's compassionate actions clearly, along with her passionate defense of James against harassment. Comments poured in from around the world, with people praising her kindness and expressing newfound respect for the royal guards. Many viewers shared their own stories of difficult working conditions and the importance of human dignity in all jobs. Sarah woke up in her hotel room completely unaware of her newfound internet fame. She was getting ready for what she planned to be her final visit to the palace before exploring other parts of London. Her phone had been charging overnight, and when she turned it on, she was overwhelmed by notifications. Messages from friends, family members, and complete strangers filled her screen. Miguel had texted her from Arizona. "Mom, you're famous. Grandma showed me the video. I'm so proud of you." Her sister Maria had sent multiple messages. "Sarah, you're all over Facebook. Everyone is talking about how amazing you are." Confused and somewhat alarmed, Sarah found the original video that had started it all. Watching herself splash water on James and then confront the teenagers felt surreal. She had acted on instinct and compassion, never thinking anyone was recording her or that it would become public. At the palace, Captain Morrison was dealing with an influx of media requests and public attention. News outlets wanted to interview both Sarah and James about the incident. The palace's communications team was working to manage the story while protecting the privacy and security of all involved. James learned about the viral video when he arrived for duty that morning. His fellow guards showed him the footage on their phones, and he was amazed to see the overwhelming positive response from the public. Comments ranged from simple expressions of appreciation to detailed discussions about working conditions and human dignity. "This changes everything," Robert said, scrolling through the comments. "Look at how people are talking about us now. They actually see us as real people doing important work." The viral video had indeed shifted public perception. Instead of viewing the royal guards as tourist attractions, people were discussing their service, sacrifice, and the challenging conditions they endured. Many viewers expressed shame about their own past behavior around guards and vowed to be more respectful in the future. Captain Morrison called an emergency meeting with his senior staff to discuss how to handle the situation. The attention was unprecedented, and they needed to ensure it was managed appropriately. They also needed to decide how to protect both Sarah and James from unwanted media intrusion while capitalizing on the positive public response. "This is an opportunity," Morrison told his team. "For years we've struggled with tourist behavior and public understanding of our guards' duties. This woman's actions and the public response show there's genuine appetite for better awareness and respect." Meanwhile, Sarah was trying to process her sudden fame while making her way to the palace. Reporters had somehow obtained her hotel information and were calling constantly. She felt overwhelmed and just wanted to see James one more time before dealing with the media circus. When Sarah arrived at the palace, she immediately noticed the increased security and the presence of news crews outside the main gates. Palace staff recognized her immediately and escorted her through a private entrance to avoid the media attention. She was taken directly to Captain Morrison's office. "Ms. Martinez." Captain Morrison greeted her with a warm smile. "I suspect you've seen the video by now." "I can't believe this is happening," Sarah said, looking overwhelmed. "I just wanted to help someone who was suffering. I never expected any of this attention." "The response has been remarkable," the captain said, showing her some of the positive comments and news coverage. "Your actions have started a global conversation about respect, dignity, and human kindness. News outlets from dozens of countries are covering the story." Sarah looked through the articles and social media posts with amazement. People were sharing stories of their own acts of kindness, discussing workplace conditions, and expressing newfound appreciation for service workers of all kinds. Her simple gesture had sparked something much larger than she could have imagined. "What happens now?" Sarah asked nervously. "That's partly up to you," Captain Morrison replied. "We've received interview requests from major news networks around the world. The palace is prepared to support whatever level of publicity you're comfortable with. But there's also something else we'd like to discuss." Captain Morrison explained that the positive response had accelerated their plans for educational programs and policy changes. The palace wanted to develop a comprehensive initiative to improve guard-tourist interactions, and they wanted Sarah to be involved as a consultant and spokesperson. "We're prepared to offer you a position as an international liaison for guard welfare and public education," he said. "It would involve travel between London and various other royal sites, developing training materials and speaking at events. The salary would be significantly more than you're earning in Arizona." Sarah felt dizzy at the prospect. A job offer in London, financial security, the chance to continue helping people. It seemed too good to be true. But she thought immediately of Miguel and her mother back home. "I have a son," she said. I can't just leave him. The position would include relocation assistance for your family, Captain Morrison assured her. We've researched excellent schools in London, and your mother would be welcome as well. We understand this is a major decision, but we believe your perspective and communication skills could benefit guards and tourists worldwide. As they talked, James was completing his morning shift with a new sense of purpose and dignity. The change in tourist behavior was remarkable. People approached the guards with obvious respect, many quietly saying thank you or I appreciate your service as they passed. Children asked their parents questions about the guards' duties instead of trying to make them react. During his break, James was informed that Captain Morrison wanted to see him. When he arrived at the office, he was surprised to find Sarah there looking overwhelmed but excited. Thompson, Captain Morrison said, Ms. Martinez and I have been discussing some significant developments. I wanted you to hear this directly, since you were at the center of what started all. This James listened with growing amazement as the captain explained the job offer and the plans for expanded educational programs. The idea that his interaction with Sarah could lead to such positive changes for all the guards seemed incredible. I wanted to ask you something, Sarah said, turning to James. If I take this position, would you be willing to work with me on developing the training programs? You understand better than anyone what guards go through and what would actually help. James was speechless for a moment. The idea of working directly with Sarah to improve conditions for all guards was beyond anything he had ever imagined when he first put on the uniform 8 years ago. I would be honored, he said simply. The three of them spent the next hour discussing practical details and timelines. Sarah would need time to arrange her affairs in Arizona and make decisions about her family's future. James would need to work with his military superiors to arrange for special assignment duties that would allow him to contribute to the program development. As their meeting concluded, Captain Morrison made one more surprising announcement. The Queen herself has been following this story, he said. She's requested a private audience with both of you tomorrow morning. Her Majesty is quite interested in meeting the woman who reminded everyone that kindness and respect should be fundamental values, even in formal protocols. Sarah felt her knees go weak. Meeting the Queen had never been part of her wildest dreams about this London vacation. James, despite his years of service at the royal residences, had never had a personal audience with Her Majesty either. What am I supposed to wear? Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. What do I say? I don't know anything about royal protocol. Just be yourself, Captain Morrison advised with a smile. Your authenticity and compassion are exactly what impressed everyone in the first place. The Queen appreciates genuine people more than perfect protocol. As they prepared to leave the meeting, Sarah felt overwhelmed by how dramatically her life was changing. 3 days ago, she had been a single mother working 2 jobs in Phoenix, saving money for a once-in-a-lifetime vacation. Now she was being offered an international position, preparing to meet the Queen, and potentially relocating her entire family to London. James walked with Sarah toward the palace exit, both of them still processing the magnitude of what was happening. For the first time since their initial interaction, they were able to speak freely without the constraints of his official duties. I never got to properly thank you, James said as they walked through the corridors. What you did that first day and then defending me against those teenagers, it changed everything for me. I had started to feel invisible, like just part of the scenery. You reminded me that what we do matters. You don't need to thank me, Sarah replied. I just saw someone who needed help. But I'm amazed at everything that's come from it. When I splashed that water on you, I never imagined it would lead to all this. They exchanged personal contact information, something that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. James shared stories about his family and his reasons for joining the Royal Guards. Sarah told him more about Miguel and her hopes for giving him better opportunities. Outside the palace, the media presence had grown even larger. News crews from multiple countries were setting up equipment, and crowds of supporters had gathered with signs thanking Sarah for her kindness. Palace security had established a perimeter to protect her privacy, while allowing her to leave safely. This is insane, Sarah muttered, looking at the crowd through the palace windows. You've touched something important in people, James observed. Look at those signs. People are talking about kindness, respect, dignity. Things that should be basic but somehow got forgotten in our social media world. Captain Morrison arranged for Sarah to leave through a private exit to avoid the media chaos. As she made her way back to her hotel, she called her family in Arizona to discuss the job offer and the possibility of moving to London. Miguel was thrilled at the prospect of living in London and attending British schools. Sarah's mother was more cautious but supportive, recognizing the incredible opportunity this represented for their family's future. That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room reading through hundreds of messages from people around the world who had been inspired by her story. Teachers wrote about using the video to discuss kindness with their students. Workers in various industries shared their own experiences with difficult conditions and lack of recognition. One message particularly moved her, from a nurse in Australia. "Thank you for showing that we can still see each other as human beings, even when our jobs require us to seem professional and distant. You reminded everyone that behind every uniform is a real person with feelings and needs." James spent his evening with fellow guards, discussing how the increased respect and attention was affecting their daily duties. The change in tourist behavior was remarkable and sustained. People were genuinely more respectful, more interested in learning about their service, and more appreciative of their dedication. "She didn't just help you with the heat," Robert observed. "She helped all of us remember why we're proud to serve." As both Sarah and James prepared for sleep, they knew that tomorrow would bring even more changes to their lives. The meeting with the Queen would be momentous, but it was also symbolic of how a simple act of human kindness had resonated far beyond anything either of them could have anticipated. Neither realized that the final chapter of their story would reveal just how deeply their brief interaction had affected not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others around the world who had been reminded of the power of compassion and human connection. The morning of the royal audience arrived with unexpected drama. Sarah had barely slept, alternating between excitement and terror about meeting the Queen. She had borrowed a conservative dress from the hotel's concierge service and practiced curtsying in her room until she felt reasonably confident she wouldn't fall over. At 8 in the morning, palace security called to inform her that the media attention had reached unprecedented levels. News crews from over 30 countries were now stationed outside the palace, and the story had become the top trending topic worldwide. The hashtag #water of kindness was being used millions of times as people shared their own stories of compassion and service. James arrived at the palace 2 hours early, his dress uniform perfectly pressed and his nerves barely contained. In 8 years of service, he had seen the Queen from a distance during ceremonies, but a private audience was something he had never imagined. Captain Morrison briefed him on protocol while acknowledging that this was an extraordinary situation, with few precedents. Sarah arrived at the palace through the private entrance, where she was met by Lady Catherine Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary. Lady Pemberton was a kind woman in her 60s who immediately put Sarah at ease. "Her Majesty is quite looking forward to meeting you," Lady Pemberton said as they walked through ornate corridors filled with centuries of history. "She's been following your story closely and is very impressed by what you've accomplished." When they reached the elegant sitting room where the audience would take place, Sarah found James already waiting. He looked nervous but magnificent in his formal uniform. Captain Morrison was also present, along with 2 other palace officials. "How are you feeling?" James asked quietly. "Terrified," Sarah admitted with a nervous laugh. "You?" "The same," he replied. "But also grateful. Whatever happens from here, I'm glad we met." At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors opened and Queen Elizabeth entered the room. Sarah and James had practiced the proper protocol, but seeing the monarch in person was still overwhelming. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, but carried herself with unmistakable dignity and presence. "Your Majesty," Captain Morrison said formally, "may I present Ms. Sarah Martinez and Guardsman James Thompson." Sarah curtsied as she had practiced while James bowed formally. The Queen approached them with a warm smile that immediately put them more at ease. "Ms. Martinez," the Queen said, her voice carrying decades of experience in putting people at ease, "I understand you've caused quite a stir with your kindness." "Your Majesty, I never intended for any of this to happen," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I just saw someone who needed help." "That is precisely why your actions were so remarkable," the Queen responded. "In our modern world, it's easy to walk past someone suffering. You chose to act with compassion, and in doing so, you reminded millions of people about the importance of seeing each other's humanity." The Queen turned to James. "Guardsman Thompson, How has this experience affected you and your fellow guards? Your Majesty, it has restored our sense of purpose and dignity, James replied honestly. Ms. Martinez reminded us that our service matters and that we deserve respect as human beings, not just as symbols. The conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, far longer than typical royal audiences. The Queen asked detailed questions about Sarah's background, her family, and her thoughts on the job offer. She inquired about James's military service and his ideas for improving guard welfare and tourist education. I understand you're considering our offer to develop educational programs, the Queen said to Sarah. What are your thoughts? Sarah took a deep breath before responding. Your Majesty, I'm honored by the opportunity, but I'm also nervous about the responsibility. I'm just a single mother from Arizona who wanted to help someone. I don't have experience with international programs or royal protocols. Those are precisely the qualifications we need, the Queen replied with a slight smile. You have something far more valuable than experience with protocols. You have genuine empathy and the ability to inspire others to be kinder. That cannot be taught in any training program. The Queen then made an announcement that surprised everyone in the room. I've decided to personally endorse this initiative and provide additional funding to expand it beyond just tourist education. We're going to create an international program promoting workplace dignity and human kindness in all service industries. She explained that Sarah's story had sparked conversations about working conditions, respect for service workers, and basic human dignity in countries around the world. Letters had poured in from nurses, teachers, retail workers, and others who felt inspired by the recognition that their humanity mattered, even when they were performing professional duties. This will be called the Martinez-Thompson Initiative, the Queen announced, recognizing both the person who showed kindness and the person who received it with such grace and dignity. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Having an international program named after her and James seemed impossible to believe. James looked equally moved, standing straighter with obvious pride. Your Majesty, I don't know what to say, Sarah managed. Say you'll accept the position and help us spread this message of kindness around the world, the Queen replied. The meeting concluded with personal gifts from the Queen, a signed photograph for Sarah to send to Miguel, and a special commendation for James recognizing his exemplary service. As they prepared to leave, the Queen made one final comment that would stay with both of them forever. You've reminded us all that the smallest acts of kindness can have the largest consequences, she said. Never underestimate the power of seeing someone else's humanity and responding with compassion. After the audience, Sarah and James were escorted to a press conference where they would officially announce the new initiative. The media attention was overwhelming, but both felt a sense of purpose that made it manageable. Sarah officially accepted the position as International Director of the Martinez-Thompson Initiative. She would relocate to London with Miguel and her mother, with full support from the palace for their transition. James accepted a promotion to Special Advisor for Guard Welfare and Public Relations, allowing him to continue his military service while developing the educational programs. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she had first splashed water on James, but now she was wearing a professional suit instead of tourist clothes, and she was leading a group of international delegates through the first official training session of their program. James stood at his post nearby, but now tourists approached him with obvious respect and understanding. Children asked thoughtful questions about his service instead of trying to make him laugh. Adults thanked him for his dedication and sacrifice. The program had expanded to royal sites in 15 countries, with plans for further growth. Workplace dignity initiatives were being developed for hospitals, schools, retail establishments, and other service industries. Sarah received messages daily from people around the world who had been inspired to show kindness to workers in their own communities. Miguel had adapted beautifully to his new school in London and was learning about British history with the enthusiasm only a 12-year-old could muster. Sarah's mother had made friends with other expatriate grandmothers and was enjoying her new adventure. As Sarah watched James complete his shift that afternoon, she reflected on how one moment of compassion had changed both their lives completely. She had come to London seeking vacation photos and memories. Instead, she had found a new career, a new home, and the knowledge that kindness really could change the world. James approached her as he was relieved from duty, something that would have been impossible before their story began. Any regrets about splashing water on a stranger? He asked with a smile. Only that I didn't bring a bigger bottle, Sarah replied, laughing. They walked together toward the palace offices where they would spend the afternoon developing training materials for the next group of international delegates. Their friendship had become the foundation of a program that was touching lives around the world, proving that sometimes the most important changes begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. The Martinez-Thompson initiative would go on to help millions of workers feel more valued and respected in their jobs, but it all started with one tourist who saw a guard suffering in the heat and decided that his comfort mattered more than following rules. In choosing compassion over protocol, Sarah had reminded the world that behind every uniform, every job title, and every professional role is a human being deserving of dignity and care.